Okay, so one more promised video. I might do more later if people keep asking specific questions about these things. And this is one I am calling A Tale of Three Classes. And the reason for this is I want to talk about three very different classes that I've had to adjust midstream to be remote learning, because for some people out there who are still trying to figure out how to do their classes, I know some of you are maybe about to come off of spring break and you've had a little reprieve. Some of you have had some time to experiment and then you'll get a spring break. Some of you have already started really doing it and you're wondering how you can adjust it if the March 27th, April 6th, whatever your school district is on, if that deadline is too soon. And I think you need to plan for it being too soon. Even if it's not, you'd be foolish not to plan for the worst, right? So what did I do? Okay, so let me talk about three different classes. So the first class is the easiest one for me. The first class is a literature class, British literature. And what's interesting about that is so much of the work is already done remotely that there was very little I had to change. So it really I began doing parts of online teaching in the 90s. And then I wasn't really teaching remotely. What it started with was basically putting the syllabus and all the assignments online. And the reason I did that was for convenience sake, both for me and for the students, because they would frequently lose their syllabus, or they would want to know what is the assignment and they'd lose it or they'd forget it. And just the ability to call it up and not have to wait until the next class to get it from me, or to look at it anytime they could get to a computer screen, was way more convenient for them. And I didn't have to keep, printing up extra copies of the syllabus just to have on hand. Back before those days, I'd usually have about 20 extra copies of the syllabus that I'd have to print just to carry around with me. And depending on how forgetful the students were, I'd either have, one or two remaining at the end of the semester or 18 remaining, which is very wasteful. So as time went on, I began to do more and more through this. So I started to distribute study guides, and I started to distribute. I started to give out the examination questions. So, and then eventually it began that the students could turn their papers in online. And it was just so much more convenient for me to get them that way. And honestly, we had so many students who at Troy University were international students who might be traveling, to their home country over Thanksgiving break or whatever, or who were athletes who might find themselves on the road or are in the band and are traveling with the athletes or whatever, where they were physically when the due date was didn't matter so much. And that was super helpful to the students and made it that I didn't have to keep track of the papers. I would know what time they were turned in. There was none of this, well, I slid it under your door. Well, you lost it. None of that, right? It was not in the file. Whatever we were using, whatever platform we were using was not there. So bit by bit, my lit classes, more and more of it started to be done online. And I used this to prevent a lot of this kind of business of running a class, to push it out of the classroom so that when we were in the classroom, all that we were doing was I would read roll, and then all we did basically for every class was get down and dirty into whatever text we were looking at, right? Talk about the text we were looking at. So because of that, almost all of the business of the class, my British literature class, was already online. It had slowly over the over the decades, I'm not that old, but over the decades, it had moved more and more online. So all I had to do was essentially put a version of my lecture, a video version of my lecture, as one of the discussion board things. I already have them do a lot of discussion boards. I just added another one. In this case, for the first text we did, I happen to have one that I used for my online version, my strictly online version of the class. I put that in there and said, hey, discuss this too. And, I'm always keep a close eye on the discussion boards. but I don't interfere a lot. And this is one piece of recommendation that I have. So now I'm finding I'm going to have to intervene more on the discussion boards. One thing, if this is the first time you've used a virtual discussion board, an online discussion board of any kind, regardless of what level you're teaching, whether you're doing, university professor like me, high school, middle school, etc., what I would recommend is don't make pronouncements on it. Don't say, that was a good point, Bob. And by the way, oh, Sally, have you considered XYZ? Instead, only ask questions. And the reason for that is no matter how confident your students are, once the professor has spoken, that's it. Like, that's the end. And you will shut down your discussion board. The very thing that you're trying to do to encourage your students to discuss more is actually shutting them down, because they've been like, okay, well, that is responded to because the professor said it and that's the answer and that's what we're going to deal with. And when you're trying to teach critical thinking or textual analysis or this kind of thing, like I'm doing in literature class, that's not helpful. So if you do, I would recommend, if you're doing discussion boards in that kind of class, intervene as little as possible. And when you intervene mostly in the form of a question. Say, could you tell us more about that, Jessica? Or whatever, rather than say, oh, did you know that scholar so-and-so said this? Well, that ends it. Okay, so that class, British literature, my early British literature class, easy peasy. I had to do very, very little. I probably spent a half hour turning that class into something that would work remotely. I might have to do, depending on how long this goes, I might have to do a couple extra videos, so it will take some more time. But, if that happens, that happens. Okay, so that's the first class. Easy. But for some of you, not easy. If you have to do discussion, that would be my recommendation to you. The next class was my history of the English language class. This is a historical linguistics class. So unlike most of the other classes in the English department, almost everything that we do, it's very basic linguistics. So we only have objective exams. Everything we do has a right answer and a wrong answer. Now, some of you out there, if you're a linguist, you're maybe getting grumpy and being like, well, there are all these questions and research. Yes. But this is the basic one, right? So they're just learning what a morpheme is, this kind of thing. So it's very straightforward. And everything was already done. Everything's already done in a way that where the examinations, because there are so many, because it's objective, I already had the examinations online. So that part was easy. But there's a really hard part for the class. So everything was done outside of class, study guide, syllabus, all distributed virtually already. But the one thing is, what do we do in class? Well, the thing that we do in class is we work through the workbook. Like that class has, that class has this workbook, and we just work through the workbook together as a class. We talk about the answers. And the point of it is, it's rather like doing a math problem, right? When you're taking a math class and you're doing an equation, when you're learning the basics, you're not solving it for your professor, right? You're not solving it for your teacher. You're learning how the solving of it works. And so the workbook is really all about, you could read the answer, but reading the answer isn't the same thing as understanding how we figure out that answer. And that requires the workbook. Well, all we do in class is work on the workbook. Well, that is, if I just give you the answers on the internet, most students are, in fact, not going to do that. So what I've had to do with that is, fortunately, that's a pretty small class this semester. That was really lucky for me, because sometimes it can be too large for this to be feasible. But what we've been doing is we've been using, in this case, Microsoft Teams, but you could use Google Hangouts, or you might have a system that your school supports, where we kind of do a virtual meeting. And we go through the workbook together. We meet during the normal class time, and we do that. First day we did it was awesome. The second day we did it, the system was laggy and it was really difficult. And we just did what we could with that. So that is a class where it actually didn't take that much changing the class to make it work. But we are having to use a new technology that makes the whole thing creaky, right? So Britlit, easy peasy. This class, I'm having to meet with them virtually regularly, and going through these things with them. All right. So those two classes obviously are very different. The one's all about critical thinking and making arguments and writing papers, and the second class is all about, is all about what is the right answer? How do we derive this answer? What was the historical events that led to XYZ? What is the science of how the mouth works, etc. And then there's the third class that I want to talk about, and that is my freshman writing class. I have taught freshman composition classes online, and it is very doable. It's labor intensive. Writing classes are generally the most labor intensive classes we have in English departments. They're the ones that require the least preparation, but semester after semester after semester are the biggest burden. I would say any semester, 90% plus of the work I do is for the writing classes. It's just the nature of the beast. And people who don't work in English departments think, how can that be possible? I've had professors in other departments say, why don't you just give them Scantrons? I can't teach someone how to write with a Scantron. It takes a lot of trial and error, writing and rewriting and revision, and talking with them specifically about what they wrote. So there's a lot of stuff. And I've developed methods for doing that, using systems where they turn things in and they revise them. Problem is, in this particular case, I was not planning for this to be a remote learning class. As many of you, the class you were doing, you weren't planning that. So I had organized it completely differently. So when I have a brick and mortar class, what I do is the first, up until the spring break in the spring, or, about those number of weeks in the fall, those number of weeks is a lot of me talking about writing while they're writing papers, and then I'm giving them, I'm writing comments and having them revise their papers. And that's what we're doing at the beginning. After spring break, what we're supposed to do is they come into the classroom and they're doing peer review with each other. They're paired up. And that's to both train them to be good peer reviewers, and also to train them and to train them how to elicit a good peer review, and also to improve their writing. Well, not only is that not doable, I'm actually banned from forcing them to get together in this circumstance. I can't put them in pairs. And even when I do, sometimes there's a student who's not prepared. If they're not prepared, I can just kick them out and assign that student to be with someone else. Well, I don't know who's going to be prepared and who isn't. I've already seen that happening. So what I've had to do is really have the number, cut in half the number of peer reviews. And I've been using Canvas to do this peer review system. Already, we haven't even done the first peer review, and already people have massively messed it up. It's not a complete disaster, but it is a problem. And so I am going to have a lot of grace with those students. I recorded another video for them, which was really nothing new. It was stuff we did in class, but it was to remind them of this, because often at the beginning of a peer review day, I'll give a little 5-minute summary of what I've said, just to remind them of the kinds of things that they need to do. Give them that again, and just keep reassigning it. They keep resubmitting their papers to me electronically. I'm looking at them. I'm leaving video comments for them. It is a lot of work. That class is by a lot the most work that I'm doing. And so I wanted to present these 3 different classes to you, because they're 3 very different classes, right? One's all about reading. One's all about science and the facts. And one's all about writing. One class is almost all me standing and delivering. Another class is about the students working together with me to figure out how to do a thing. And then the last class is the students doing a lot of individual work and learning how to work in pairs. And the only thing I'm doing normally in the classroom is making sure they're not slacking off. And so, as you'll see, I took really different responses to these. And so, a lot of people I've been talking to have been saying, like, well, if they're teaching like elementary school where they have multiple subjects, it's like, well, in my science class, we do this, but in my math class, we do this. I can't do two different things. And I've had to say many times, well, why not? I mean, is it, you mean you're not able to, or you just feel like you shouldn't? Well, it wouldn't be good to do it two different ways. Well, no, yeah, you should feel free to teach different subjects in different ways, to adapt your classes in different ways. In some classes, different things are going to have to fall through the cracks. In other classes, you're going to find that moving a lot of the busy work of the classroom offline is going to help you a lot. One thing I don't do anymore, I spend no time taking roll. Why? Because I can automatically see if someone is there already, right? It's recorded for me that they showed up in the video, in the conference call, right? So there's no taking roll. There's none of that. So some of the busy work of the class is removed and gives me time to do other things and to kind of focus on the things that are harder to do and don't translate as well. So those are three very different classes. I hope they give you some ideas of approaches you might take to your classes. And I hope you also feel the freedom to take different topics and different subjects and adapt them to remote learning in different ways.